Now, back in those days, standard silver was 11/12 pure. But later on, it was revised to 9/10 or 0.900 fine, or 9/10 pure, or simply 412.5 grains, the overall weight. Nevertheless, the pure silver content between both of those, or among those, were both the same, 371.25 grains. In other words, the same amount of silver as was contained in the Spanish mill dollar, the peso de 8 real, the piece of 8. On the other side of our break, we were talking about the language of the Constitution, the use of the word money, the use of the word coin, the use of the word tender, and payment, and such. And the fact that our founding fathers knew what they were talking about, even if we in our generation do not. You know, according to R.S. Yeoman's 1962 Guidebook of United States Coins, page 123, he says, quote, "The Spanish dollar, or piece of 8, was widely used and familiar to everyone in the English-American colonies. It was only natural, therefore, that the word dollar was adopted officially as the standard monetary unit of the United States on July 6, 1785. Now, we're going to take notice, first off, that this is the monetary unit. So I ask the question, can a unit of the money become the money for which it is the mere unit? No. But notice also that this was on July 6, 1785, prior to ratification of the Constitution. Already, we were using the word dollar as our official unit of money, sort of like the yard and the inch, the mile. Those are all intangible. You can't see, smell, hear, taste, nor touch them. And you can't see, hear, smell, taste, nor touch a dollar. This was all prior to the Constitution, and it was 7 years prior to the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792, which was first written to carry out the constitutional mandate concerning our system of lawful money. You see, our founding fathers knew what they meant by the word dollar and the word money. It is we who have been separated from those meanings by a group of language manipulators with an evil agenda. Now, as to the matter of printing and issuing bills of credit, you know, things like United States notes, gold and silver certificates, and so forth, that power was stricken out of the Constitution. Okay, and I'm going to take a couple references. I'm going to go to the history of coinage and currency in the United States and the perennial contest for sound money. This was written by A. Barton Hepburn. He was ex-comptroller of the currency, ex-superintendent of banking for the Department of the State of New York, and vice president of Chase National Bank. Now, this is a 600 and some odd page book. This is no small book. And this man is no dummy when it comes to the subject of money banking and credit. This was written in 1903, and I'm going to turn to page 60 and 61 of his book. Quote, "Fresh from their experiences with continental paper currency, so disastrous to all, it would appear reasonable to assume," page 61 now, "that the intention of the framers of the Constitution was to prohibit all issues of legal tender paper by Congress. George Bancroft," keep that name in mind, George Bancroft contends, in antagonism to the Supreme Court, that was when they came out with the Juliet versus Creeman decision in 1884. And George Bancroft was 84 years old at that time. He was born in 1800. He contended, in antagonism to that Supreme Court, that the record of the proceedings of the convention leaves no doubt of such intention. Let's go on. Quote, "Upon the question whether the power to emit bills of credit, as stated in the draft of the Constitution then under consideration, should be given the United States, Gouverneur Morris, in opposition, remarked that if the United States have credit, such bills will be unnecessary. If they have not, will be unjust and useless." He was vigorously supported by other delegates. Ellsworth said it was a favorable moment to shut and bar the door against paper money. Wilson said that the striking out of the provisions would remove the possibility of paper money. Langdon preferred rejecting the whole plan, that's the whole Constitution, if you will, rather than retain the 3 words, "and emit bills." Madison, who hesitated to strike out the words, finally assented, after having, as he said, satisfied himself that it would not disable the government from using its credit, in other words, it could borrow money on credit, but would cut off the pretext for a paper currency, and particularly for making bills a tender, either for public or private debts. Okay, now that's footnoted. Where? Well, it goes to Bancroft, a plea for the Constitution. And in that plea for the Constitution, this historian, George Bancroft, a well-regarded historian, was quoting Eliot's debates of the Constitutional Convention. His book, A Plea for the Constitution, written in 1886. Now the words of A. Barton Hepburn. Quote, the words were stricken out by a vote of 4-1, actually it was 9-2, and unquestionably the convention intended to withhold from the federal government the power to create paper money with legal tender attributes. End quote. Period. End of story. Okay. Now, I see we've got a break coming up here, and on the other side of the break, I'm going to go to A Plea for the Constitution, written by George Bancroft. Mine is a 1982 rather than an 1886 edition. Mine's a reprint. But George Bancroft, according to the man who wrote the foreword, and that was F. Tupper Saucy, now deceased, quote, knew the intent of the framers, expounders, and executors of the United States Constitution, better perhaps than any of his contemporaries. Born in 1800, he had personally talked with James Madison, John Adams, and Lafayette, had known Andrew Jackson and Polk and every president since Monroe. He was well qualified to discuss our Constitution as it applied to foreign nations. He was Secretary of the Navy, founder of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, minister to Germany. He even knew Lord Byron and Baron Rothschild. We'll get back to him on the other side of this break. Welcome back to this segment of Datum Line, Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 8. We're now into the book, A Plea for the Constitution, originally written in 1886 by the historian George Bancroft. He says on page 38 here, quote, the refusal of the convention, that being the Constitutional Convention 1787, to confer on the legislature of the United States the power to emit bills of credit or irredeemable paper money in any form is so complete that, according to all rules by which public documents are interpreted, it should not be treated as questionable. But as the truth in this case is of infinite importance and has been questioned by those in authority, the wrong done to the Constitution may justify a simple narrative of the facts which ample and indisputable records establish and which no power can alter. I hope you're listening, American Free Press. Page 39. By a clause in the 9th article of Confederation of the United States of America, and only by that clause, the Confederated States had authority, quote, to emit bills on the credit of the United States, end quote. The 8th clause of the 7th article in the first draft of the Constitution was as follows, quote, the legislature of the United States shall have the power to borrow money and emit bills on the credit of the United States. Okay, this is taken from the Journals of the Convention in Eliot's Debates, Volume 1 at page 226. Okay? The Journal of the Convention for August 16th makes this record. It was moved and seconded to strike out the words and emit bills. And the motion to strike out these words passed in the affirmative. Yeas, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, 9. Nays, New Jersey, Maryland, 2. This taken from the Journal of the Convention, Eliot's Debates, Volume 1, page 245. So the convention, by a vote of more than 4-1, says Bancroft, refused to grant to the legislature of the United States the power to emit bills on the credit of the United States. For the interpretation of this record, I'm on page 40 now, Madison, the best possible witness, has left this note, quote, striking out the words cut off the pretext for a paper currency, and particularly for making the bills a tender, either for public or private debts. This taken from Madison's notes, Gilpin, page 1346, Eliot's Debates, volume 5, page 435. Madison was the chief author, says Bancroft, of the new Constitution. Its opponent, Luther Martin, the Attorney General of Maryland, a delegate to the Federal Convention and present at the debate, read to the Maryland House of Delegates a paper in which he gave his account of the purpose of the convention. His evidence agrees exactly with that of Madison, and for nearly 100 years, his fidelity as a witness was as little questioned as that of Madison. Here are two witnesses, page 41 now. Madison, who approved the prohibition, and Martin, who condemned it. The court, what court? This is the Juliet versus Greenman Court, 1884, the Supreme Court. The court pushes the testimony of Madison aside as if he had, quote, not explained himself, end quote. Bancroft was taking the words of the Supreme Court because they didn't think that Madison had really understood or explained himself very well. Anyway, the court pushes the testimony of Madison aside as if he had, quote, not explained himself, end quote, sufficiently. Though on the point in question, his words are as clear as sunlight. The address of Martin, the court rejects as a philippic, that being a caustic remark, though it contains not a word of invective against any individual and does contain the clearly expressed wishes of its author, that being Martin, quote, not to wound the feelings of any person. Okay? Now, these are also footnoted. Let's continue. The question before the convention was, shall power be granted to the legislature of the United States, quote, to emit bills of credit? The first witness is Gouverneur Morris, a man free from illusions, a delegate from the state which contained Philadelphia, then the most opulent city in the 13 states, and as by his interest he was nearly connected with the city and state of New York, he thoroughly represented the interests of commerce. He moved to strike out the grant of power to emit bills on the credit of the United States, saying, if the United States have credit, such bills will be unnecessary. If they have not, will be unjust and useless. The seconder of Gouverneur Morris was Pierce Butler, a delegate from South Carolina, then the richest commercial state in the South. He remarked in the course of debate that, quote, paper is a legal tender in no country in Europe, end quote. And he was urgent to withhold from the government of the United States the power to make it so. That's from Eliot's Debates, Volume 5, page 434 to 435. Madison. No, I won't bother there. We're not going to run. We're going to run out of time. Let me go to page 43. The words of Oliver Ellsworth, our third Chief Justice, were, quote, this is a favorable moment to shut and bar the door against paper money. The mischiefs of the various experiments which have been made, and those were by the states, by the way, are now fresh in the public mind and have excited the disgust of all the respectable part of America, end quote. I'm not going to have time in today's broadcast, but in another broadcast, I'm going to mention some of these authors, like Dr. Charles Norburn and others, who make glowing remarks about the bills of credit that were issued by the state of Massachusetts in 1690, 1692. Now, that's nonsense. And that's why these people in the Constitutional Convention were striking this power from even the federal government to do it. And they were going to prohibit the states from doing it as well. Why? Because the mischiefs of the various experiments, plural, which have been made, plural, are now fresh, are plural, in the public mind and have excited the disgust of all the respectable part of America. James Wilson, in concurrence with Ellsworth, said, it will have a most salutary influence on the credit of the United States to remove the possibility of paper money. This expedient can never succeed whilst its mischiefs are remembered. And as long as it can be resorted to, it will be a bar to other resources. George Reed spoke for Delaware. quote, the words, if not struck out, I'm quoting him now, would be as alarming as the mark of the beast in Revelation, end quote.